The air inside Belle Rêve's grand hall lay thick and motionless, a tapestry stitched from 70 years of undisturbed dust mingled with the faint, sweet decay of forgotten jasmine. Sunlight, fractured by grimy panes, cast stripes across the wide, plank cypress floor, illuminating dust motes that danced within the heavy quiet. At the center stood a monumental grandfather clock, its dark mahogany casing carved with intricate, almost menacing floral patterns, standing sentinel. Its pendulum had ceased its rhythmic swing decades earlier, its hands frozen at 2:45, a silent testament to a moment lost to time. And yet, within its stillness resided a weight, an unspoken promise that something profound, something long buried, awaited discovery in its silent depths. Before we proceed with the story of Belle Rêve and the secrets it held, take a moment to reflect on the echoes of the past that linger in forgotten places. The year was 1935, and Arthur Finch, a man whose youth had been weathered by the Great Depression, found himself amid the decaying grandeur of Belle Rêve, a Louisiana plantation inherited from a distant, almost mythical great-aunt. The estate, nestled deep within Bayou country, was a sprawling monument to a bygone era, its once proud columns now peeling, its vast fields choked with wild cane and Spanish moss. The air was perpetually humid, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the distant, earthy perfume of cypress swamps. Arthur, practical by nature, saw only the immense task of restoration, a burden that felt heavier than the humid air itself. Yet the clock in the main hall, a silent, imposing monolith, drew his gaze repeatedly. It was not merely old, it felt ancient, imbued with a presence that transcended its function. Its face, of tarnished brass, bore no maker's mark he could discern, only the frozen hands, perpetually stuck. 70 years, his grandmother, Era, had murmured, her voice thin as old lace. 70 years, and that clock ain't told no time. The number resonated with a peculiar chill, a span of human life, a generation sealed within its silent mechanism. Belle Rêve, or Beautiful Dream, as its original French name implied, was anything but a dream. Now it was a waking ghost, a sprawling two-story mansion with wide verandas that sagged under the weight of time and neglect. The paint on its cypress siding had long since surrendered to the relentless Louisiana sun and rain, flaking away to reveal dark, weathered wood beneath. Giant live oaks draped with thick beards of Spanish moss stood like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching toward the house, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to shift with unseen currents. The air, even indoors, carried the faint, sweet and sour tang of the nearby bayou, a mix of stagnant water, rich soil, and the occasional, almost imperceptible scent of decay. Arthur had arrived in late spring, the heat already a suffocating blanket pressing down on everything. He had left the bustling, desperate streets of New Orleans, where the Depression had bitten deep, for this isolated inheritance, a place he had only heard whispered about in hushed tones by his grandmother. She was a woman of quiet strength, her skin like worn leather, her eyes, though clouded by age, still holding a sharp, knowing glint. Era had lived her entire life in the shadow of Belle Rêve, though never in it, always in the small, weathered cabin a mile down the dusty road, a cabin that had once been part of the sprawling quarters for the enslaved. She spoke little of the plantation's past, her words often trailed off, her gaze distant, as if seeing ghosts in the humid air. Belle Rêve, she had said, her voice raspy as Arthur prepared to leave for the estate, was a place of grand illusions. Arthur, don't let its faded finery fool you. Some dreams, they turn to nightmares when the light hits them just right. Her words, cryptic and heavy, had settled in Arthur's mind like dust on old furniture. The main hall, where the clock stood, was the heart of the house. Its ceiling soared, adorned with a cracked plaster medallion from which a crystal chandelier, now missing most of its prisms, hung like a skeletal spider. The wallpaper, once a vibrant damask, had faded to a sickly yellow, peeling in strips that curled like ancient parchment. The furniture, draped in white sheets, resembled shrouded figures waiting for a resurrection that would never come. But it was the clock that truly commanded attention. A masterpiece of craftsmanship, its dark wood polished to a deep sheen despite the dust, its brass face gleaming faintly. The intricate carvings depicted scenes of pastoral life, shepherds, lambs, blooming roses, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence it now kept. Arthur, a man of 28, felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He wasn't sentimental, but the sheer scale of neglect, the palpable sense of lives lived and lost within these walls, was overwhelming. He spent his first few days simply exploring, mapping the decay, trying to understand the scope of his inheritance, the library with its rows of leather-bound books crumbling to dust, the dining room with its long, scarred, empty table, the bedrooms upstairs, each with a four-poster bed and dressing table, all covered in sheets like a house of sleeping giants. He found himself drawn back to the clock again and again. Its silence was profound, almost defiant. He tried to wind it, to move its hands, but they were locked solid. A thin, almost invisible seam ran along its right side, suggesting a hidden panel, but it was sealed tight, as if fused with the wood. He ran his fingers over the cold brass, over the intricate carvings. He noticed a small, almost imperceptible scratch near the base, a tiny, deliberate mark that seemed out of place amid the clock's otherwise perfect facade. It was a detail that sparked a flicker of curiosity, a tiny ember in the vast, cold hearth of the house. He spoke to Era about it during one of his visits to her cabin. The cabin, though small, was meticulously kept, filled with the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs. Era sat by the hearth, even in the heat, her hands busy with mending. "That clock," Arthur began. "It's a strange thing. Doesn't work. Looks like it hasn't in ages." Era paused, her needle hovering over a patch of worn fabric. Her eyes, dark and deep, met his. 70 years, I told you. Since the war ended, almost to the day." Her voice was low, a murmur against the crackle of the small fire. "Old Miss Clara, she sealed it up herself. Nobody touched it since." "Sealed it up? Why?" Arthur pressed, a new layer of intrigue settling over him. Era sighed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Some things, Arthur, are best left sealed. Some truths, they ain't meant for the light of day. Not after so long." She turned back to her mending, her silence a wall Arthur couldn't breach. But her words, old Miss Clara resonated. Clara Thorne, his great-aunt, the last mistress of Belle Reve before its slow, agonizing decline. What could she have sealed inside a clock? And why? The question gnawed at him, a persistent hum beneath the drone of cicadas outside. The clock, once merely an old piece of furniture, now felt like a vault, a silent keeper of a story that refused to die. Arthur's fascination with the clock grew into a quiet obsession. He found himself spending hours in the main hall, not working, but simply observing the silent monolith. The oppressive humidity of the Louisiana summer pressed in, making the air inside the house feel thick and heavy, yet the clock stood impervious, a cool, dark presence. He ran his hands over its smooth, aged mahogany, feeling the subtle undulations of the wood grain, the sharp edges of the carvings. He noticed the faint, almost imperceptible scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and faint, clinging to its surface. He tried every conceivable method to open the hidden panel Era had alluded to. He pressed. He twisted. He ran his fingers along every seam and joint, searching for a latch, a button, a secret mechanism. The clock, however, remained stubbornly closed, a silent challenge. Its ornate brass face, with its Roman numerals and delicate frozen hands, seemed to mock his efforts. He even tried to pry at the seam with a thin knife, but the wood was too old, too brittle, and he feared damaging the antique. "It's like it's part of the house itself," he muttered to himself one sweltering afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. The silence of Belle Reve was profound, broken only by the distant buzz of insects and the occasional creak of old timbers settling. The isolation was absolute, amplifying his growing fixation. He felt a strange connection to Clara, the woman who had sealed it. What could have driven her to such an act? What secret was so potent, so dangerous that it needed to be locked away for 70 years? He returned to Era's cabin a few days later, the question burning on his tongue. He found her on her small porch shelling peas, her movements slow and deliberate. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and blooming honeysuckle. "Grandma," he began, "about that clock. You said Clara sealed it. Did she ever say why?" Era paused, a pea pod held delicately between her gnarled fingers. Her gaze drifted past Arthur toward the distant shimmering heat haze above the fields. "Clara," She was a strange one, even for a thorn. Always had a fire in her, even when she tried to hide it. After the war, after everything, she changed, like a storm had passed through her soul and left nothing but quiet devastation. But the clock, Arthur insisted, his voice tinged with impatience. Era finally looked at him, her eyes holding a depth of sorrow he couldn't quite fathom. She said it was to keep time from moving. To hold a moment, she said, a moment that should never be forgotten but could never be spoken. She shook her head slowly. She spent days on it, Arthur, locked herself in that hall. Wouldn't let nobody near. When she came out, her eyes were red, but her jaw was set. And that clock, it was silent ever since. Arthur felt a shiver despite the heat. A moment that should never be forgotten, but could never be spoken. The words echoed in his mind, painting a picture of profound grief and a desperate act of preservation. He thought of the small scratch he'd noticed on the clock's base. It wasn't a random mark, it was a tiny, almost imperceptible L carved into the wood, barely visible unless you knew to look for it. He hadn't paid it much mind before, dismissing it as an old imperfection. Now it seemed to glow with significance. An L. Who was L? He returned to Belle Reve with renewed purpose. He examined the clock again, this time with a magnifying glass he'd found in the dusty library. The L was indeed there, finely etched, almost hidden by the grain. He ran his finger over it, a strange sense of connection to the past washing over him. Then he noticed something else, something he'd missed before. Near the top of the clock, just beneath the ornate pediment, was a tiny, almost invisible pinhole. It was so small, so perfectly blended with the wood that it was nearly impossible to spot. He remembered a story Era had once told him about Elias Thorne, Clara's father, a man known for his meticulousness and his love for intricate puzzles. He had a collection of tiny, almost needle-like tools for repairing delicate mechanisms. Arthur went back to the library, rummaging through old drawers and forgotten boxes. He found a small, velvet-lined case, and inside, a set of delicate watchmaker's tools. Among them was a slender, almost hair-thin steel probe. He returned to the clock, his heart thumping with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He carefully inserted the probe into the pinhole. There was a faint click, barely audible above the thrumming of his own pulse. The hidden panel, the one he had searched for so diligently, sprang open with a soft, almost apologetic sigh of old wood. A wave of musty, ancient air, thick with the scent of dried paper and something else, something faintly floral and melancholic, wafted out. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were three objects: a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, a small, tarnished silver locket, intricately engraved, and a single pressed dark red rose, its petals fragile as butterfly wings. Arthur reached in, his fingers trembling slightly, and carefully retrieved the journal. The leather was cool and smooth beneath his touch, the paper rustling softly as he opened it. The first page bore a name written in elegant, looping script: Clara Thorne, Belle Reve, 1858. Arthur carried the journal to the library, the only room in the house that still felt somewhat habitable despite the dust and the pervasive scent of decay. He settled into a worn leather armchair, the journal resting heavily in his hands. The light filtering through the grimy windows was dim, casting long shadows that danced with the dust motes. He opened the journal again, the brittle pages crackling softly. Clara Thorne's elegant script filled the pages, faded but still legible, a voice from 70 years ago reaching out across time. The early entries painted a picture of a young woman, intelligent and observant, living a life of privilege on a grand Louisiana plantation in the late 1850s. Clara wrote of her studies, her piano lessons, the social calls, the endless summer days filled with the drone of cicadas and the scent of magnolia. She spoke of her father, Elias Thorne, with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was a man of immense presence, a patriarch who ruled Belle Reve with an iron will, his word law. Clara's mother, who had died when Clara was young, was mentioned only in passing, a faint memory. August 12, 1858. Papa returned from New Orleans today. He brought me a new book of poetry, but his eyes held that familiar, distant look. He spoke of cotton prices and the need for more hands. The heat is stifling. Even the air feels heavy with unspoken things. Clara's entries slowly began to shift, revealing a growing unease beneath the veneer of plantation life. She wrote of the enslaved people not as property, but as individuals. She observed their quiet resilience, their songs, their sorrows. She spoke of Lena, a young woman of her own age who worked in the main house. Lena was described with quiet admiration, her grace, her intelligence, the way she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to defy her circumstances. October 5, 1859. Lena was ill today. Papa sent for the doctor, which surprised me. He usually leaves such matters to the overseer. But Lena, she has a quiet strength about her, a spirit that even Papa seems to acknowledge, though he would never admit it. Her eyes hold a wisdom far beyond her years. I find myself drawn to her quiet presence, though we are separated by an unbridgeable chasm. Arthur paused, looking at the locket. It was small, oval, and tarnished, but he could make out delicate floral engravings. He carefully pried it open. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, faded daguerreotype of a young woman with striking, intelligent eyes and a serene expression. Her features were refined, her skin a warm, deep brown. On the other side, a lock of dark, tightly coiled hair was preserved under a thin sheet of glass. This, he knew, must be Lena. The L on the clock, the pressed rose, it was all for her. He returned to the journal, his heart heavy. The entries continued, detailing the subtle shifts in the household, the unspoken tensions. Clara, it seemed, was becoming increasingly aware of the hypocrisy and cruelty that underpinned her privileged existence. March 20th, 1860. Papa has been spending more time in the quarters. He says it is to oversee the new planting, but I see the way Lena avoids his gaze, the way her shoulders are often hunched. There is a tension in the air, a silence that screams louder than any argument. I feel a knot of dread in my stomach, a premonition of something terrible. The journal then chronicled Lena's pregnancy. Clara's entries became more frantic, filled with desperate, impotent rage. She wrote of her father's cold denial, his absolute control, his refusal to acknowledge the truth that was becoming increasingly evident. The child, Clara realized with horror, was Elias Thorne's. July 1st, 1860. It is true, Lena is with child, and Papa, he denies it with a vehemence that chills me to the bone. He says it is a lie, a fabrication. But I see the truth in Lena's eyes, in the way she carries herself, in the way Papa avoids her gaze. My heart aches for her. What will become of her, of the child? The entries grew darker, detailing Elias's decision to sell the child once it was born. Clara's pleas, her arguments, her desperate attempts to appeal to her father's humanity were all met with cold, unyielding resolve. Elias saw only a problem, a stain on his reputation, a complication to be removed. November 15th, 1860. The child is due soon. Papa has made arrangements. He will sell it. Sell his own blood. I begged him. I pleaded. I wept. He looked at me with eyes colder than winter ice. He said it was for the good of the plantation, for the good of our name. He said it was a necessary evil. Necessary evil. My soul recoils from his words. I feel a profound shame, a complicity in this horror, even though I am powerless. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the humid air. The sheer casual cruelty of it, laid bare in Clara's elegant hand, was sickening. He looked at the locket again, at Lena's serene face, and then at the pressed rose, its dark petals a symbol of a love, a life crushed before it could fully bloom. The weight of the past, of this specific, terrible past, settled on him like a shroud. He understood now why Era had been so reluctant to speak. Some truths were indeed too heavy for the light of day. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the journal's pages turned, revealing a deeper, more agonizing layer to this hidden history. The entries continued, each word a hammer blow to Arthur's conscience. Clara's writing, once elegant and composed, became increasingly agitated, reflecting the turmoil within Belle Reve and within her own soul. The year 1861 dawned, bringing with it not only the birth of Lena's child but also the ominous rumblings of the Civil War. January 22nd, 1861. The child was born last night, a boy. He is beautiful, with Lena's eyes but Papa's mouth. Lena held him for but a few hours. Her cries, they haunt me. I tried to intervene, to offer to raise him myself, to keep him here. Papa merely laughed, a cold, hollow sound. He said it was already done. The buyer was a man from Mississippi, a planter named Davies. He left with the child before dawn. Lena, she is a ghost. Her spirit, once so bright, has been extinguished. I feel a profound, suffocating guilt. I am a coward. I did nothing. Arthur closed his eyes, picturing the scene, the new mother, her child torn from her arms, the cold indifference of Elias Thorne, the helpless despair of Clara. The locket with Lena's image felt heavy in his palm. He imagined the small pressed rose, a silent witness to this unspeakable act. The sheer brutality of it, the casual destruction of a family, was almost too much to bear. He sought out Era again, the journal clutched in his hand. The old woman was sitting on her porch, staring out at the fields, her face a roadmap of ancient sorrows. The air was thick with the scent of rain, a storm brewing in the distance. Grandma. Arthur's voice was hoarse. I read it. About Lena, about the child. Era turned slowly, her eyes, though dim, holding a piercing intensity. So the clock finally gave up its ghost, did it? Clara always knew it would one day. She gestured to the empty chair beside her. Come sit. There's more to that story than Clara could ever write down. Arthur sat, the journal still open to the entry describing the child's sale. She wrote that Elias sold his own son. His own blood. Era nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Elias Thorne was a man who valued his name, his reputation, above all else. A child born of a slave woman, a child that carried his features, that was a stain he couldn't abide. He saw it as a weakness, a challenge to his authority. She paused, her gaze hardening. Lena, she was his daughter, too, you know. Not just his property. His blood. But he never saw her that way. Never. Arthur stared at her. Lena was Elias's daughter. Clara's half-sister. Era's gaze hardened. Her mother, a woman named Adeline, was brought here from Virginia. Elias took her when she was barely a girl. Lena was born soon after. Clara knew, she always knew, deep down. That's why she felt such a kinship with Lena, such torment when her father did what he did. A new layer of horror settled over Arthur, the incestuous cruelty, the double betrayal. And the child, Lena's son. What happened to him? Era's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with a pain that 70 years had not dulled. He was sold south, to a sugar plantation in the Delta. Never heard of again. Lena, she never recovered. She moved like a shadow after that. The light went out of her eyes. She stayed at Belle Reve, but she wasn't truly there. She just existed. And Clara? Arthur asked, thinking of the journal, of her desperate, futile pleas. Clara tried to make amends in her own way, Era said, her voice laced with bitter understanding. She would sit with Lena, read to her, try to bring a flicker of life back to her eyes. But it was too late. The wound was too deep. And then the war came, and everything changed, and yet nothing truly changed for Lena. Era paused, her gaze distant, lost in the past. I remember Lena. She was a quiet woman, but she had a spirit, a fire. She loved to sing, soft, low spirituals that would make your heart ache. After the boy was taken, she stopped singing. She just faded. She died a few years after the war, a quiet death, like a candle flickering out. They buried her in the old slave cemetery under a weeping willow. No headstone, just a mound of earth. And you, Grandma? Arthur asked, a sudden realization dawning. How do you know all this? You speak of Lena as if you knew her intimately. Era's eyes, ancient and knowing, met his. A profound silence descended, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. I knew her, Arthur, better than anyone. Because I was there. I was born on this land, just like Lena. And I was there when the child was taken. I was there when Lena died. And I was there when Clara sealed that clock. Arthur felt a jolt. You were there. But how old were you? Era offered a faint, sad smile. Old enough to remember. Old enough to understand. Old enough to carry the weight of it all these years. She looked at the journal in his hand. Clara, she tried to do right. In the end, she tried to preserve the truth, even if she couldn't change the past. That clock, it was her way of making sure Lena's story wasn't completely erased. A silent monument to a life stolen. A truth buried. The storm broke then, a sudden deluge of rain lashing against the porch, mirroring the storm of revelations that had just broken over Arthur. The past wasn't just a story in a journal, it was a living, breathing entity, embodied in the quiet strength of his grandmother, Era. The L on the clock, the locket, the rose, they were not just symbols of Lena, but of a legacy of pain and silent defiance that had been passed down through generations. The rain continued to fall in sheets, washing the dust from the ancient oaks and turning the red earth of the plantation into slick, dark mud. Inside Era's cabin, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and the unspoken weight of generations. Arthur sat stunned as Era continued to speak, her voice a low, rhythmic murmur against the drumming rain. Clara, she was a good woman in her heart, Era began, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. But she was a thorn, and the thorns, they had a way of seeing the world only through their own eyes. She saw the injustice, yes, but she was trapped, just like Lena was. Trapped by her name, by her station, by the very house she lived in. She wrote in her journal about her guilt, Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. About being a coward. And she was right to feel it, Era replied, her tone devoid of judgment, merely stating a fact. We all carry our burdens, Arthur. Hers was the burden of silence, of complicity. But after the war, after the world turned upside down, she found her own way to fight back, to speak a truth that had been silenced. Era recounted the days following the end of the Civil War, the chaos and uncertainty that swept through the South. Belle Reve, like many plantations, was a shadow of its former self. The enslaved people, now free, began to leave, seeking new lives, new beginnings. Lena, however, remained. Her spirit, broken by the loss of her child, found no solace in freedom. She stayed, a quiet, almost spectral presence moving through the decaying house and fields. Clara watched her, Era explained, watched Lena fade away day by day. And I think in those quiet moments, Clara understood the true cost of her father's cruelty, not just the loss of a child, but the destruction of a soul. It was then, in the desolate aftermath of the war, that Clara conceived her defiant act. She spent weeks preparing. She meticulously transcribed Lena's story, not just from her own journal, but from conversations she'd had with Lena, from the fragments of memory Lena had shared in her moments of deepest despair. She wrote of Elias's true nature, of the child, of the locket and the pressed rose, symbols of a life stolen. She knew the truth would be buried, Era said, forgotten, twisted by the thorns who would come after. So she decided to hide it, not to destroy it, but to preserve it. To make sure that one day someone would find it, and Lena's story would finally be told. Arthur looked at the clock, now a symbol of both profound cruelty and desperate hope. She sealed it for 70 years. Why that specific number? Era smiled faintly, a sad, knowing smile. 70 years is a lifetime, Arthur. It's enough time for the dust to settle, for the old lies to crumble. It's enough time for a new generation to come along, a generation that might be ready to hear the truth, to bear its weight. Clara, she was a visionary in her own way. She knew that some truths need time to ripen, to become undeniable. Arthur then asked the question that had been burning in his mind since Era's earlier revelation. Grandma, you said you were there. You knew Lena. You were born on this land. Who are you to Lena? Era's gaze met his, unwavering. The rain outside softened to a drizzle, and a sliver of weak sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the fine lines etched around her eyes. Lena was my mother, Arthur. The child Elias Thorne sold, that was my older brother. I was born 2 years later, after the war had already begun. Elias never acknowledged me either, he just tolerated my presence. My mother, Lena, she was already broken by then. She couldn't protect me. But Clara did what she could. She made sure I was cared for, that I learned to read, that I knew my mother's story, even if I couldn't speak it aloud. Arthur felt a profound shock, a dizzying sense of connection to the past. His own grandmother, the quiet, resilient woman who had raised him, was the daughter of Lena, the enslaved woman whose story was hidden in the clock. He was directly descended from this tragedy, this unspeakable cruelty. The weight of the journal, the locket, the pressed rose suddenly felt immense, a tangible link to his own bloodline, stained by the very history he was uncovering. Clara, Era continued, her voice soft, she couldn't save my brother. She couldn't save my mother from her sorrow. But she could make sure their story lived. She sealed that clock not just with a journal, but with a promise that one day the truth would emerge. The silence that followed was deep, resonant with the echoes of generations. Arthur looked at his grandmother, seeing her not just as an old woman, but as a living testament to the enduring power of memory, of resilience, and of a truth that, despite all efforts to bury it, had finally found its way into the light. The clock, once a mere object, now stood as a monument, a silent, powerful witness to the unspeakable history of Belle Reve and the quiet defiance of the women who refused to let it be forgotten. The revelation of Era's true parentage, her direct lineage to Lena and Elias Thorne, sent a tremor through Arthur's understanding of his own family history. The dusty halls of Belle Reve no longer felt like a distant inheritance, but a living, breathing entity, its walls imbued with the cries of his ancestors. The humid air, once merely oppressive, now felt heavy with the weight of unspoken grief and generations of injustice. Arthur spent the next few weeks in a feverish state, poring over Clara's journal, cross-referencing dates, trying to piece together the fragments of Lena's life and the fate of her lost child. He revisited the old crumbling ledgers he'd found in the library, searching for any mention of the sale, any record of a transaction involving a child in early 1861. The ledgers, meticulously kept by Elias Thorne, were filled with cotton yields, supply purchases, and the names of enslaved people listed as property. He found an entry, chillingly brief, Jan 23, 1861, one male infant to Davies, Mississippi, $300. The cold, impersonal language was a stark contrast to the human tragedy it represented. He also began to question Era more deeply, gently probing her memories. She spoke of Lena's quiet despair, her refusal to leave Belle Reve even after emancipation, as if rooted to the very soil that had witnessed her greatest loss. She said she couldn't leave, Era recounted, her voice raspy with age. Not until she knew what became of her boy. She always hoped, even when there was no hope left. She'd sit by the road, watching, waiting for a face she'd never truly known to return. Arthur felt a profound ache in his chest. The image of Lena, a ghost haunting the very landscape of her sorrow, was unbearable. He tried to trace the Davies family in Mississippi, writing letters to county clerks and historical societies, but the records were sparse, fragmented by the war and the passage of time. The trail, 70 years cold, seemed to vanish into the vast, indifferent expanse of history. The community, too, seemed to sense a shift in Arthur. His inquiries, once casual, now carried a desperate urgency. When he visited the general store in the nearest small town, the old men who usually sat on the porch whittling wood and swapping stories grew quiet when he approached. Their eyes, once curious, now held a guarded, almost weary expression. He heard whispers, fragments of old gossip about the Thornes and their peculiar ways, about things best left buried. The name Elias Thorne still carried a chill, even decades after his death. One sweltering afternoon, while exploring the overgrown gardens behind Belle Reve, Arthur stumbled upon a small marker, almost completely swallowed by kudzu. It was crude, unadorned, and half buried in the earth. He cleared away the vines and dirt, revealing a single hand-carved word, Lena. Below it, a smaller, almost illegible inscription, my heart, my hope. He knew instinctively that this was Lena's grave, a secret marker placed by Clara, perhaps in the dead of night after Lena's quiet passing. The pressed rose from the clock, he realized, was likely from this very spot. He returned to the house, the small hand-carved marker now a new, tangible piece of the puzzle. He placed the locket and the pressed rose beside the journal on the library table. The three objects, once disparate, now formed a complete, heartbreaking narrative. He looked at the clock, its silent face no longer a mystery but a profound statement. It was a tombstone, a memorial, a defiant act of remembrance. The psychological toll on Arthur was immense. He found himself waking in the dead of night, haunted by Clara's words, by Lena's silent suffering, by the image of the child being taken away. The oppressive heat of the Louisiana summer seemed to amplify his unease, making the air thick with the ghosts of the past. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, a burden to ensure that this story, once hidden, would never be forgotten again. He was no longer just an heir, he was a custodian of a terrible truth. He spoke to Era about the grave marker. She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with familiar sorrow. Clara, she did what she could. She couldn't save them, but she could remember them. That was her penance, and her promise. But what about the child? Arthur asked, his voice raw. Did anyone ever try to find him? Did Lena ever have any hope? Era sighed, a deep, shuddering breath. Hope is a dangerous thing, Arthur. Especially for those who have nothing else. Lena, she held on to it like a lifeline, even as it choked her. After the war, when the world was supposed to be new, a few of the freed men, they tried to help her. They sent word. They asked around. But the Delta was a vast place, and a child sold young, they vanished like smoke in the wind. There was never any trace. The finality of her words hung in the air, a heavy, crushing weight. The mystery of the clock had been solved, but the tragedy it contained only deepened with each new revelation. Arthur realized that the true tension wasn't in what was hidden, but in the enduring, agonizing consequences of that hidden truth. The clock had been opened, but the wounds it revealed were still fresh, still bleeding, 70 years later. The oppressive humidity of late summer pressed down on Belle Reve, making the air thick and still, a perfect stage for the final, devastating act of this long unfolding drama. Arthur, now fully immersed in the plantation's dark history, felt the weight of it in every breath. He had exhausted all avenues in his search for Lena's lost child. The records were too sparse, the trail too cold. The silence of the past was absolute on that front. He sat with Era on her porch, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, reflecting the turmoil within him. The air was alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant croaking of frogs from the bayou, a symphony of nature that seemed indifferent to human sorrow. "Grandma," Arthur began, his voice heavy, "I've read everything. I've searched. There's no trace of Lena's son. It's like he vanished completely." Era nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her profile etched against the fading light. "Some wounds, Arthur, they never heal. They just scar over, and sometimes even the scar aches." She paused, then turned to him, her eyes holding a profound, ancient sorrow. "There's one more thing, Arthur. A part of Lena's story that Clara couldn't bring herself to write, not fully. A part that only those who lived it could truly know." Arthur leaned forward, his heart pounding. He sensed a final, crucial piece of the puzzle, a revelation that would complete the horrifying picture. "After the boy was taken," Era began, her voice barely a whisper, "Lena, she was never the same. She moved through the world like a ghost. But Elias Thorne, he wasn't done with her. He saw her brokenness, her despair, not as a reason for pity, but as a new form of control." Arthur felt a cold dread creep up his spine. "What do you mean?" He kept her close, Era continued, her voice gaining a quiet intensity. "He made her his personal maid, his shadow. He would have her serve him day in and day out in that very house. He would make her watch him, serve him, as if to remind her of her place, of her loss, of his absolute power over her. It was a cruelty far worse than any whip. It was a slow, agonizing torture of the spirit." Arthur gasped, a sound caught in his throat. The image of Lena serving the men who had stolen her child, forced to endure his presence, his casual indifference, was a torment beyond imagination. "It was a psychological prison," Era added, her voice trembling slightly, a daily reminder of her powerlessness. And he would speak of the boy, not to her directly, but within her hearing. He would talk about the good price he got, about how the boy would make a fine field hand one day. He wanted her to hear it. He wanted her to suffer. He wanted to break her completely. The true nature of Elias Thorne's cruelty, Arthur realized, was not just in the act of selling his own son, but in the prolonged, sadistic torment he inflicted upon Lena afterward. It was a calculated, deliberate destruction of a human soul, a testament to the depths of his depravity. Clara, in her journal, had hinted at Elias's coldness, his control, but she had shielded herself, and perhaps her readers, from the full, brutal extent of his psychological warfare. Lena endured it, Era said, her voice filled with quiet reverence for her mother's strength. She endured it for years. She never cried in front of him. She never broke. She just existed, until one day she simply lay down in her bed and didn't wake up. Her spirit, it had finally given out. She died of a broken heart, Arthur. As surely as if he had put a bullet through it. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. Arthur felt a profound, visceral understanding of the clock, of Clara's desperate act. The clock wasn't just a repository of a secret, it was a monument to Lena's silent suffering, a testament to the unspeakable cruelty she endured, and Clara's desperate attempt to ensure that even in death, Lena's story would not be erased by the men who had so thoroughly destroyed her life. The locket, the pressed rose, the journal, they were all pieces of Lena, preserved against the tide of oblivion. And Clara, Arthur finally managed to say, his voice raw. She witnessed all of this. Era nodded. She did. And it broke her too, in its own way. She couldn't stop her father, but she could make sure his evil, and Lena's suffering, would not be forgotten. That clock, it was her final act of defiance against her father, against the silence, against the injustice that had consumed them all. The full weight of the past crashed down on Arthur. He understood now the true reason the clock was sealed, the profound meaning behind its 70 years of silence. It was a tomb, a memorial, a silent scream against the casual brutality of a system that allowed such horrors to flourish. The something hidden inside was not just a journal, but the agonizing, unvarnished truth of a life stolen, a soul crushed, and a legacy of pain that echoed through generations, finally brought to light by the turning of a key, 70 years later. The sun had fully set, plunging Belle Reve into a deep, humid darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the oil lamp on Era's porch. Arthur sat in silence, the weight of the revelations pressing down on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket. The story of Lena, of Elias Thorne's calculated cruelty, and Clara's desperate act of preservation had woven itself into the very fabric of his being. He was no longer just an heir to a decaying plantation, he was the reluctant custodian of a terrible, undeniable truth. "What will you do now, Arthur?" Era asked, her voice soft, pulling him from his reverie. Arthur looked at the journal, the locket, and the pressed rose now laid out on the small table between them. They were no longer mere objects, they were relics imbued with the suffering and defiance of the past. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw. This changes everything. Belle Reve isn't just a house anymore. It's a monument to a crime, a testament to a life stolen." He thought of the grand hall, of the silent clock, now an open wound in the heart of the house. He thought of the L carved into its base, a tiny, defiant mark against oblivion. He thought of Lena, his own great-grandmother, a woman whose life had been systematically dismantled by the very men who was her father. And he thought of Clara, his great-aunt, who despite her complicity had found a way to speak the truth from beyond the grave. "You carry the truth now, Arthur," Era said, her hand reaching out to gently touch his arm. Her touch was surprisingly strong, comforting. "It's a heavy burden, but it's also a sacred one. Lena's story, my mother's story, it can finally be told. It can finally be heard." Arthur looked at his grandmother, her face illuminated by the flickering lamplight, seeing in her eyes the echoes of Lena's quiet strength, her enduring resilience. He realized that Era, too, was a living testament to the past, a direct link to the suffering and the survival. "I can't just let it be forgotten again," Arthur declared, his voice firming with newfound resolve. "Not after all this. Not after Clara went to such lengths." Not after Lena suffered so much. He spent the next few months not on restoring Belle Reve to its former glory, but on preserving its truth. He meticulously organized Clara's journal, carefully preserving the brittle pages. He had the locket and the pressed rose cleaned and placed in a protective case. He began to document everything, to write down Era's memories, to piece together a comprehensive account of Lena's life and the horrors she endured. He felt a profound sense of purpose, a duty to ensure that the silent scream of the clock would finally be heard, loud and clear. Belle Reve itself remained largely untouched, its decay now seen not as neglect but as a poignant reflection of its history. The Grand Hall, with its silent clock, became a somber memorial. Arthur understood that the house could never truly be a beautiful dream again, not with the weight of its past. Instead, it would stand as a stark reminder, a place where the echoes of human cruelty and quiet defiance would forever resonate. Arthur never found Lena's lost son. The trail, 70 years cold, remained lost to history. But in telling Lena's story, in bringing her truth to light, he felt a profound sense of closure, a quiet victory against the forces of oblivion. He ensured that the name Lena, once whispered in fear and sorrow, would now be spoken with reverence and remembrance. The clock in the main hall of Belle Reve remained silent, its hands frozen at 2:45. But now its silence was not one of forgotten time, but of profound memory. It stood as a sentinel, no longer guarding a secret, but proclaiming a truth, a testament to the enduring power of a story that, against all odds, had finally emerged from the shadows 70 years later to demand its rightful place in the annals of history. What do you think of this story? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on the hidden truths that time can sometimes reveal.